Welcome to part 6. Let's get started. You can control inheritance using the keyword final. In the case of the Class A definition, final indicates that you cannot inherit from A. When B tries to inherit A, there's an error condition. In the case of function definitions within the class, final indicates that a subclass cannot override that function. B inherits from C, but cannot override the function do it. Now types, in this particular case classes, can be viewed as an object. There's only one of them in the system. So in other words, a class can have properties and a class can have functionality. Now in this example, class A has a variable num, and static indicates that it's for the class only, and it has a function do it. Now, using class for that function definition as opposed to static means that classes that inherit from A can override that function. If I would have used the keyword static instead of class, it wouldn't have been possible to do the override. Now in the simple example here, you see that to access the num property, I just say a.num. So I'm doing it on the class as opposed to on an instance of the class. Properties. So far, we've only talked about simple stored properties. They're variables within an instance of a structure class, so on. There's storage. There's another type called computed properties. You need so-called setters and getters. In other words, those properties are calculated. I'm going to go through a piece of code that uses setters and getters for computed properties. But first I want to describe what the problem is that the code implements. Let's say you want a structure that represents a circle. Now a circle has three characteristics. It has a radius, it has an area, and it has a circumference. Now they're all mathematically related to each other. Given one of them, you can determine the other two. So in terms of representing a circle, in other words, a stored property, you could pick any one of the three. Now, given basic geometry, unit circle or radius 1, it's probably the simplest to just store the radius. So that's the only stored parameter. Now, the other two, you can calculate the circumference based on the radius. You could set the radius based on the circumference, and the same is true for the area. You can calculate it from the radius, and you can set the radius based on the area. Let's take a look at the code. Obviously, I'm going to need the value of pi. In SWIFT3, that can be obtained by saying double.pi. In this code, I'm just simply going to create a global constant called pi, just to reduce the number of characters in the code. I have a structure called circle, and it has one stored variable called radius, and it's initialized to 1.0. That'll give me a default unit circle. I have two variables which are both computed. I have area and I have circumference. They're explicitly typed as doubles. Now, there's a set and get for each one of them. Okay, so in other words, when I set the area, the set will get invoked. When I get the area, the get will be invoked. The same is true for the circumference. Now, if you take a careful look at these, the sets always affect the radius, which is actually the stored value. The gets return a value based on calculating it from the radius. Now, there is a function described, which is simply a print output that gives the values for various circle representations. Now, if you look at the code, I have a variable called C, and I'm instantiating a circle. No parameters in the initializer. What I'm getting is the unit circle. That's the first one described. And then what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to change the area to 1, describe it, and I'm going to change the circumference to 1. Now, down on the bottom pane, you see the values. If you take out your iPhone, bring up the calculator app, and turn it sideways, you can verify them. That's it for part 6. It's it for Swift Basics in general. Let's go to the photo, and I'd like to make a closing statement. Putting together this 6-part series was somewhat challenging. Swift is a very powerful language, and it's somewhat difficult to define what are basics, how much is necessary to write decent code. The other is, how do you not overwhelm the beginning programmer or underwhelm the experienced programmer? When you post something on the internet, you never really know who the audience is. I hope I've achieved the right balance. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the Cocoa Touch Netcast channel is about iOS development. There's 59 videos prior to these 6 covering the basics of Xcode in iOS. Granted, they're 2 years old, and they're in Objective-C. However, the vast majority of the concepts are still valid. Stay tuned for future material, and have a great day.